Okay, welcome to our final Care Ethics Zoom lecture for the year. I'm Dan Inkster. I'm a professor in the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston and director of the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership, which sponsors these events. The plans continue next year with this series, so keep an eye out for emails. I think maybe we're going to try to put together some kind of advisory board and formalize things a little bit more. So, so I'm excited for all that to happen. Today, our presenter is, sorry about that, I'm trying to let everyone in. Our presenter is Rika Pratz, who has an affiliation in the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies Department at Duke University. She received her PhD at the Institute for Social Justice at the Australian Catholic University and is part of the Revaluing Care in the Global Economy Network, which is hosting this conference you see here at Duke on May 12th through the 14th. And Professor Prattes has had a big hand in organizing this conference. I will put in a moment, I'll put the link for this conference in the chat. So you all can check it out and register for it. It wasn't clear to me until just now that all the panels are going to be live streamed and recorded, so you can access them. So I encourage you all to participate in that conference and attend some of those panels if you're able. In some of her previous work, Professor Prattes has looked at the outsourcing of social reproduction, particularly domestic cleaning, with particular attention to the practices of men. She continues exploring the link between men and caring in today's paper, Learning Through Care, Decentering Dominant Epistemologies to Theorize Caring Men at the Center, which is forthcoming in the volume, the edited volume, Decentering Epistemologies and Challenging Privilege, Critical Care Ethics Perspectives. Which is edited by Maggie Fitzgerald and Sophie Bourgeau and Fiona Robinson. Our commentator today is Maggie Fitzgerald, who is an assistant professor in political studies at the University of Saskatchewan. Her research focuses on global ethics and international political theory, with an emphasis on decolonial ethics, normative and critical international relations theory, feminist political economy, and the ethics of care. Her work, has appeared in journals such as Ethics and Social Welfare and Critical Studies in Gender, Culture, and Social Justice. And as just mentioned, she's one of the editors of the forthcoming volume, Decentering Epistemologies and Challenging Privilege, in which Professor Pratt's paper will appear. Our format today is the usual one, but for newcomers, the way things usually go is our presenter, Professor Pratz, will speak for, 20, 25 minutes about her paper. Professor Fitzgerald will then give a 10 or 15-minute commentary, and we'll give Professor Pratz a couple minutes then to respond if she wants. And at that point, we'll open the floor to questions and comments and discussion. It's all usually pretty free-flowing here. The way that you can indicate if you want to ask a question, the easiest way is to just put into the chat, type I have a question, and I'll call on you in that order. So let's just go with that plan since that's worked for us in the past. So let me now pass things over to Professor Pratz.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really honored to be speaking as part of this group here that so many people whose work I admire so much. So it really is a great honor. And thank you to Maggie for agreeing to respond to this paper, which is also really exciting. So Dan, thank you for already sort of doing the promotion work for me. And I also meant to put in the link, but I guess I won't be able now because I'm not very good at multitasking. So if you do that, I would very much appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna see if that works here. Does it transfer to the next slide? Do you see the second slide now? Okay, perfect. Perfect. Okay, I have to get my notes and get started. In 2014, as a precursor to my current project, I worked on an empirical study that dealt with the quote-unquote outsourcing of domestic cleaning from Viennese middle-class households to migrant women in the informal market. My focus then was particularly set on the positions and practices of men in these households, which are rarely researched in scholarship on the International Division of Reproductive Labor. And I argued that leaving out the voices and practices of men on the work of care, however marginally involved some men might be, actually reinforces or works to reinforce the dominant perception that domestic and care work is quote unquote women's work and not crucial societal labor that, should be really done by everybody. So doing research with white German-speaking middle-class, cis, able-bodied and well-educated men, I investigated how they took care of their apartments, took care of their places, what they did and did not do, what they knew or did not know about the work of care. And I was and continue to be interested in embodiment and practices of care, especially as they relate to epistemology. So I'm asking, what do people learn from doing care work, and what content and ways of knowing can be found around the work of care? And the project in 2014, in a conversation with Michael, who was one of the participants in the study in Vienna, my focus on embodied practice as a locus of learning about care work was confronted head on. So Michael reported that he often said to his woman partner as a sort of standing joke between them, and I quote from Michael, "Actually, I clean the whole of the flat because I pay for the domestic worker," end quote. And so I was first quite baffled by his conflation of paying for and doing the work of cleaning. And quite obviously, it becomes difficult to trace the epistemic consequences of embodied practices of care when their existence is negated in this way. So in Michael's quote, "There's nothing of potential value that could be learned from doing care work. Paying for cleaning for Michael has the same impact, epistemic or otherwise, as doing the cleaning." And starting with this anecdote, I want to think about the possibilities of taking care of a place, now broadly defined, in the absence of embodied practice, and whether that is possible at all. And I think that it is not. So the paper engages with two crucial aspects of knowledge formation: embodiment and place. And I'm thinking of being placed here not only in the sense of positionality and social situatedness, as it has been highlighted by feminist and social epistemologies over the past 4 decades, but of place as an active agent and knowing collaborator for human knowledge making, as highlighted in many or most indigenous epistemologies, and we could say since time immemorial. The glimpses from my empirical study in Vienna that will come in again below might look banal maybe compared to those discussed indigenous ways of knowing. I want to make the case though that mundane everyday care practices are important, and that it is through them that worlds are made, and that it matters, to paraphrase Françoise Vergès, who cleans the world. I hope that this is a helpful contribution to the ongoing challenges to the dominance of a particular Western epistemology that has been variously termed an epistemology of separation, epistemology of mastery, or epistemology of control, which is to say I aim to work against the violent core of the dominant Western/colonial tradition of knowledge production, which is always connected to a history of extraction and exhaustion, by highlighting other ways of knowing that exist, the many epistemologies that do recognize connection, relationality, and interdependence, as well as practice, embodiment, and place. And so I'm going to give you a little overview of the talk. The first section, Decentering the Center, is in the written version of this text actually quite long, but it's short here. And so here I say that the dominant version, or the dominant Western paradigm of epistemology, is both too narrow and simultaneously too wide for my purposes. And I build on existing critiques of that paradigm from feminist scholars, including care ethicists. Then the sections 2, 3, and 4, embodiment, place, and practice, I move to specifically draw on feminist and First Nation scholarship, as well as feminist First Nation scholarship, to further this decentering, particularly through learning from embodied and place-based epistemologies. So while section 2 emphasizes that centered ways of knowing are embodied, section 3 adds onto that the importance of place for knowledge formation. And it closes by posing the question of how learning from indigenous place-based epistemologies can be achieved without this being epistemic extractivism. So without it being yet another iteration of relations of coloniality. In section 4, practices, I try to answer this question by suggesting we look to practices. And in my case, that's men's caring practices of care work, to go beyond sort of a colonial trajectory. Care practices are both embodied and located in specific places, and this is true for all worlds. Thus, focusing on practices allows Western subjects to mobilize embodied and place-based epistemologies without necessarily extracting from indigenous worlding practices. Rather than appropriating from other quote-unquote worlds, such learning from indigenous epistemologies and their diversity could help, I hope, Western subjects to become rooted in our own places and to develop more attentive and responsive epistemic practices that are rooted in place in ways that can build connection and that crucially do not harm others. Wrong direction. So the first section. What am I doing here? Technology. Okay. So here I am, as already mentioned, building on some of the many existing challenges from feminist and social epistemology that critique the dominant paradigm. And so I say that for my purposes, dominant paradigm is, as I said, both too narrow and simultaneously too wide, and cannot easily grasp the kinds of knowledges and the ways of knowing that to do with care that I'm interested in. And so first I emphasize that, for instance, the consideration of emotions and affects, embodiment, experience, practice, as well as the specificity of place in the knowing process, which are all crucial to an epistemological investigation of men and care in the global north, are not sufficiently accounted for within the dominant framework that focuses narrowly on the cognitive and that privileges propositional knowledge. And then second, the dominant framework of minority world epistemology is also too wide in that it lacks a clear ethical dimension, so it lacks accountability. As Steve Woodley puts it, accountability is the flip side of recognizing interdependence as a plain fact, which is to say, because we depend on one another, we ought to be accountable to these others we are interwoven with, also in our knowledge formation practices. And in short then, in its limitless quest for knowledge that lets substantial ethical aspects fall by the wayside of knowledge formation, the dominant epistemology of the minority world is too wide, while with its traditionally tight focus on human, we should also add cognition only, its tendency to focus on objects which are perceived as detached or at least detachable from their environments and relations, its disregard of affects, emotions, intuitions, experiences, practices, and human and more than human bodies, the epistemology of separation is too narrow. And it is too narrow to grasp the forms and content of knowing that I'm interested in here in relation to care work. And so in the following sections, I turn to embodied and place-based epistemologies to even more thoroughly decenter the harmful Western version of epistemology. As has been mentioned, I've previously written about how epistemic ignorance shapes and reproduces unjust structures in the international division of reproductive labor. And so here I am interested in a different kind of relationship between knowledge and ignorance, engaging with the potentially positive implications, epistemic implications that can arise out of performing caring labor, evinces how difficult it is to grasp this kind of knowledge as knowledge under the dominant Western paradigm of epistemology. And so as maybe we could say knowledge that is ignored, it points to ways of knowing that do not register within a framework that is narrowly trained on the cognitive and propositional form. Central knowledge is around care, I argue, are held in bodies, and they emerge out of and are transmitted through embodied practices, such as domestic and care performance. And I use the term bodies of knowledge to emphasize that knowledge is located and embodied. And in contrast to a view from nowhere, knowledge here emerges somewhere, and it emerges in a specific place and in the interactions of human and more than human bodies. Focusing on bodies, I want to make sure, though, that I'm here imagining bodies not as bounded, discrete, or isolated, but on the contrary, we could say bodies that have fuzzy edges and that are interdependent and interwoven through knowing practice. And I'm here also taking cue from earlier anthropological work on the so-called dividual or partible self. So bodies move through dynamic interactions of knowledge making and need to be grasped beyond an either or binary framing of knower versus known, While knowledge might be held, as I say, in bodies as spaces, this holding is not static or fixed, but a dynamic process between moving and changing bodies. And the next important point is that bodies of knowledge do not necessarily have to be human bodies. And again, learning from indigenous epistemologies, we could say bodies of water are bodies of knowledge, non-human animals, stones, the land itself as a complex interweaving of coming together of diverse integral parts, engage with one another in producing knowledge and hold knowledge. And so knowledge does decidedly not emerge through the investigation of a disjointed or isolated object of study, through a neutral, detached, isolated, independent knower under pure, quote unquote, conditions that are uncontaminated by its world, but on the contrary, knowing emerges through interdependence, through intermingling parts in dynamic processes that are very much part of their respective worlds. And this brings me to the next point, which is that knowledge is located in place. So I now turn to epistemologies that consider not only embodied practice, but also place, as well as care and accountability. And I want to turn to Aboriginal Australian epistemologies that evince a more elaborate understanding of the importance of place to knowledge formation processes. So take, for instance, the existence of song lines. So they're also called song spirals, which are paths across land and sometimes also the sky that mark the roots of ancestral creators of Aboriginal Australia. They are navigational routes, geographical, cultural, and spiritual, that trace places of significance. And they connect humans to country. So let me refer to scholar and Nikanawawa traditional owner Anne Polina when she talks about the Malaloo songline project to record, map, and maintain the ceremony of this particular songline that runs from Balginshire to Malaloo in Western Australia and covers significant parts of the Madawara, the Fitzroy River. So Polina says that songlines are profound, and I quote her, "They are profound, they are still alive, because one of the things Indigenous people say is the land is alive, the rivers are alive, the country is alive, because it holds memory," end quote. Polina explains how it was important to pass on the knowledge so in this particular project, that knowledge about the songline in an appropriate manner that was, as she says, respectful to the land, but importantly, respectful to the songlines. And the actualization and transmission of this knowledge required embodied performance, such as dancing and singing, but first it required being in a specific place. So the dancers and new knowledge holders had to be on Nikana country and be with the elders to travel through the landscape and do ceremony at each significant place. As Polina puts it, and I quote from her again, "So we had to go to countries so countries could see that we were legitimate and that the transfer and this knowledge and wisdom were going to Ninga men who were ready to carry the songline into the future by learning and engaging country now," end quote. And so we have here respect, legitimacy, responsibility, and care that are all necessary to hold and to share knowledge. Practice and performance are key to knowledge production and transmission, and accountability and care are crucial, as is the specificity of place. So knowledge comes into existence through a collaborative effort of human and more than human people. And in this particular songline, it's, for instance, ancestral serpents that are in the songline with country. And this is to say, in this framework, knowledge emerges not only in place, but with and as country. And I also maybe need to add that country in this particular Aboriginal Australian English, so how that Aboriginal Australian English word is used is more than like mere land. It's sort of nature and culture and song and dance and trees and like everything that is there in place, as well as people, and people here also includes ancestors and also future generations. So it's a very encompassing concept of that is country. So I want to add that I recognize the specificity of the epistemology, this epistemology on Nikana country, as rooted in and significant to that particular country that cannot simply be transferred to other places. And still, I think that there are certain features of that epistemology that stand out as relevant in other contexts as well, such as the importance assigned to place, embodiment and performance, and accountability and care. So such co-becoming of country alongside or with human and non-human persons is a central part of caring for country in different Aboriginal Australian contexts. And caring with country, or as Babaka country have called it, in Yolngu country in the north, in northeast Arnhem, so again Australia, caring as country is crucial in Aboriginal epistemologies. And here embodiment is based on bloodline to country, as Maurice Robinson terms it. This kind of relationality, such interdependent embodiment with place, is unfamiliar to most non-Indigenous people, as we lack this kind of level of place-centeredness. And as Shea Welch poignantly puts it, and I quote from Welch, she says, Western frameworks, because grounded in universality, atomistic individualism and hierarchy, do not recognize the importance of place, since the recognition of relations of space and place would have precluded, or at least most certainly caused, great cognitive difficulty and dissonance for their colonial ventures, end quote. So that leaves me with the question of how or would Western epistemology change if place were regarded as important for and beyond knowledge formation practices? And could an attentiveness to place decenter the violent core of the dominant paradigm that ceaselessly seeks to extract human and non-human resources, quote unquote? And how can those of us who are not embedded within them learn from place-based epistemologies? Or is the use, quote unquote, so my use of Indigenous epistemic wealth to solve problems of the North itself an extractivist project? And I put that to you as a serious question, like it's an open question for me. And so looking for answers to this question, then I turn to practice in the next section. That again. Okay. Okay. Drink a sip of wine. So in critical studies on men and masculinities, we currently find a renewed attention to men and care. And scholars have highlighted that men can be competent caregivers and that structurally privileged, so white, cis, heterosexual, middle-class, able-bodied men do perform care work, albeit they do so in vastly different numbers to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, as well as white women, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. Social scientific masculinity scholars have identified the importance of men's embodiment to care, though not all are very interested in sort of the epistemological implications of that. Gillian Ranson emphasizes, for instance, that embodiment is crucial for fathers caregiving for their babies. And she also argues that fathers learn to care, that this learning makes care work visible to them as work, and that finally, by performing the work of care, men are transformed as people. And I also want to refer to Neil Hanlon's work, who makes very similar observations and similar arguments. The vast majority of studies on men doing the work of care focus on fathering. And within the hierarchy of domestic and caring labor, I would say fathering is currently the most visible and also most valued work for men. And here, by contrast, I'm specifically interested in sort of the less valued caring work of domestic cleaning, which is hardly investigated and especially, again, concerning men. And it is important to note that the work of fathering, again, emphasizes a human-to-human relationship, whereas the work of cleaning, while also directed towards the well-being of human persons, obviously, necessarily engages place. And therefore, I think it is more readily related to the more than human we share spaces with, and to the attentive and inattentive practices to emerge from these interactions. In my study in Vienna, I did research with white, well-educated cis men and their women partners who paid migrant women for domestic cleaning services in the informal market. And the men in my sample performed very little reproductive labor, as most of it was done either by women domestic workers or the women partners who lived with them. And still, as I show in this section, I found glimpses of knowledge that emerged through their embodied domestic practices in these privileged men's narratives. And it was here that my interest in the relationship between knowledge formation and embodied care practices, or embodied practice in general, was again amplified. In this study, I use a mix of different empirical methods that you can read about elsewhere. And one of these was so-called go-alongs, in which I accompanied the men in my sample in a routine domestic task of their choosing. And with this method, so like other participants in the study, Jakob told me that generally he found the enjoyment of cleaning to be a bit weird, in his words. And so he strongly associated what he called a mania for cleaning with women, thus setting himself and his masculine performance apart from devalued, ostensibly feminine work. Jakob also told me that generally he was more interested in the gadget side of household cleaning and connected the fact that he favored tasks involving electrical appliances, such as vacuum cleaning, for instance, over mopping or wiping with masculinity. And there were several points in my interactions with Jakob where he was attentive towards his domestic space and dirty matter in that space. And this embodied attentiveness was most strikingly brought to the fore by Jakob's detailed description of using a steam broom, which is an appliance for cleaning tiles. And in his go-along, he also used that steam broom for demonstration and mentioned to me little speckles of toothpaste that were clinging to the bathroom floor, and that just by mopping the floor wet, he says, cannot be removed. Without the steam broom, Jakob asserts, yes, you often have to scratch them off the floor. And this is a quote from him. And so this intimate knowledge of what domestic work his household requires and the necessary skills involved in cleaning the floors, I argue, stem from Jakob's embodied performance of engaging in reproductive labor, of actually doing some of that cleaning himself. So attentiveness is an embodied skill that is critically important for caring labor, is honed in practices of performing care work. In the go-along, Jakob's attentiveness towards the specificity of different kinds of dirt. So besides the toothpaste that I already mentioned on the bathroom floor, he also mentioned splatters of food on the kitchen floor, the dirt from pets or that brought in from the streets. They all become very tangible in his performance. Distinct forms of attentiveness to dirt and the knowledge and skills needed to clean the dirt away are facilitated by or emerge out of the embodied practices of cleaning themselves. And this knowledge, I want to say, is held in his body. Though it emerges, I argue, not spontaneously out of his body, but through an interactive process that he engages in through his body with the specific place, within the specific place of his apartment and within the socio-political economic space in which he's located. And that also makes paid domestic cleaning possible. In this process, his human body comes into contact through a domestic practice with other parts that are crucial for the emerging knowledge. And I argue that knowledge here is relationally co-constituted between Jakob's human body, the materiality of dirt, the electrical appliance of the steam broom, and the very space of his home. Moreover, Jakob's embodied knowledge is shaped by the larger context within which he is performing this work. So Jakob is doing this task within a context in which reproductive labor is racialized and feminized, and typically not assigned to subjects like him. And it is not valued labor, not thought of as requiring specific skills. At the time of the interview, Jakob is hardly engaging in his practice with the steam broom any longer because after a little break, his household is now again paying a migrant woman to do this work. And this brings me already to the last section, just the conclusion. Keep doing this. Sorry. So yeah, and so here in the conclusion, I want to come back again to this question of how to learn from indigenous epistemologies without extracting from indigenous epistemologies. So drawing on feminists and specifically indigenous scholars to decenter the dominant paradigm has led me to the question of how to learn from epistemological frameworks, such as the non-dominating ones that I've hinted towards in this talk, in a way that is relationally humble and respectful. And I think that to do so is actually no small feat, given the power asymmetries among and between the worlds we live in. Epistemic appropriation, as defined by Amelon Davis, is comprised of two distinct but connected features. So first, she talks about epistemic detachment, and second, epistemic misdirection. So on the first point, Davis maintains that while the harm of epistemic appropriation does not hinder targets of epistemic appropriation from putting knowledge into the public domain, members of marginalized groups are never acknowledged as contributors. and that is which is essential to the perpetuation of their epistemic marginalization. So the knowledge is taken up, but it's not connected to the author of the knowledge. And so I try hard to not detach the epistemologies from their worlds and recognize and reference authors, collective, and places connected to the epistemologies that I draw on. And still, the project could be read as not able or unable to avoid the second epistemic harm that Davis outlines, which is that of misdirection. And this is because I suggest that learning from relational epistemologies that recognize embodiment, practice, and place, care, and accountability, in order to investigate privileged men at the center. And so for the epistemic wealth that I draw on to be useful, we could say, in the global north. However, the ultimate goal, as I try to outline, is that of decentering the dominant paradigm and to challenge the dominance and violence of the epistemology of mastery. Joanne Ray, who's a Darug woman, so Darug is the First Nations country in the western parts of Sydney, so again, Australia. Ray urges that educating non-Indigenous people to become literate in reading, relating with, and caring as country. So in her language, that's Nura, so Nura is country. And that this learning for non-Indigenous people as well is at the heart of sustainable futures. A recognition of relationality and interdependence with place is crucial for living together well, and at this stage is also essential to planetary survival. And Ray writes, and I quote, "With a country-centric way of being, our ways of knowing are also going to be centered in Nora, so in country, and involve knowing through experiential contextual learning for the pragmatic purpose of doing as caring. Such a praxis involves reciprocity with and as Nora," end quote. So the country-centric way of being and knowing that Ray describes involves attentive and responsive embodied practices. And learning from embodied and place-based epistemologies to develop one's own located epistemic practices might not be that straightforward for folks located in the Western paradigm, yet it is critical. And it is equally critical, I think, that this learning takes place in ways that does not appropriate Indigenous epistemic wealth in an extractivist manner, and that it diverts from rather than is continuous with coloniality. Thank you. That's it for me.
Wonderful, thanks. That was great. Great talk. And I will now pass things over to Professor Fitzgerald to provide a reply or comments, I should say.
Yes, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I also want to take a moment and thank Dan. I've been fortunate to participate in 2 of these sessions now, and I've attended a variety of others. And I really think the forum that you've created here is invaluable to our community, particularly during the pandemic when we were so isolated. So thank you truly for all of your work organizing these. I also want to thank Rika for that excellent talk and for sharing your work with us today. I've been following Rika's work for several years now, but I remember in particular how struck I was by her 2020 article, "I Don't Clean Up After Myself: Epistemic Ignorance, Responsibility, and the Politics of the Outsourcing of Domestic Cleaning." That article draws upon Rika's in-depth study of heterosexual couples in Austrian households who outsource domestic work, a study that was, of course, referenced here today. In that research, Rika argues that the systematic failure to see what and who we are connected to in the domestic realm is indeed shaped by gendered and racialized relations of power and driven by an epistemology of separation that affords some the privilege of ignorance. I remember being especially interested in the fact that Rika looks at men and their care practices, or lack thereof, to uncover this epistemology of ignorance. Perhaps somewhat ironically, centering questions of men, care, and caring epistemologies is crucially important. If we are to understand how gender norms and patriarchy work to devalue care and unevenly distribute care responsibilities, we must also understand men's experiences of care and non-caring. More broadly, Rika's work, I think, truly demonstrates how we can only make sense of gender and patriarchy as a whole if we also pay attention to the position of men within the social order and the consequences of this positioning in a variety of spheres of life. We can see, of course, that Rika is continuing to study many of these same themes in her work today. I also think, however, that today's presentation is building and expanding on these themes in important and significant ways. Here, Rika is weaving together questions of men, masculinity, epistemic privilege and irresponsibility, and different critical epistemologies, which have sought to decenter a specific dominant Western epistemology that upholds the legitimate knower as disembodied, atomistic, rational, and abstracted from sociopolitical context. Critiquing this dominant Western epistemology, referred to by various monikers like epistemology of control and epistemology of mastery, has in many ways been at the heart of the Care Ethics Project since Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice. In Gilligan's research on moral development, as many of you know, Gilligan listened for and heard another form of moral reasoning, one which differed greatly from the justice or rationalist model which dominated at the time, and perhaps which still dominates, although I am optimistic that we're seeing some shifts in that area. Since Gilligan's work, a variety of moral voices have been articulated in care scholarship, or perhaps more accurately, a variety of moral voices have been heard. For as Indigenous activist Laura Holland of the Wet'suwet'en Nation reminds us, those who are marginalized and oppressed have and always have had voice. The problem so very often is that others are not listening. I think in many ways, Rika, your project here is in line with this point about listening, as you are clearing space to hear epistemic claims that are grounded in other ways of knowing that are not abstracted and decontextualized, but instead embodied, embedded, and place-based. I also think that focusing on practices, which are, as you so eloquently put it, always embodied and in and of some place, is extremely important for this task. It is through practices that we come to know, if it is through practices that we come to know, then understanding who is responsible for conducting certain practices, like cleaning up toothpaste splatters on the floor, and who gets a pass from certain practices, to borrow Joan Tronto's terminology, will also help us understand how certain knowledges arise and circulate, and how and why other knowledges hold less epistemic currency. So for example, if Michael never has to clean up his space because he is paying for that to be done for him, he will never engage the epistemic resources inherent in that practice. He will never know the knowledge that arises through that practice, such as how to care for the space in which he finds himself and in which his relations with others often unfold. This results in an epistemic ignorance, or a gap in Michael's knowledge that comes from his not having to engage in care practices. Tracing these dynamics, as you do so beautifully here, Rika, is a key task for understanding where epistemic ignorance arises and how these gaps keep certain topics out of the scope of broader political dialogue. Why would Michael, for instance, listen seriously to claims about care and care responsibilities when his own lack of engagement in care practices means he has far less epistemological resources to draw upon that would allow him to really understand the importance of care practices in the first place? Rika, I also very much appreciate how while in your talk today, you seek to draw upon a variety of epistemologies that see embodiment in place as key epistemological resources. You also highlight the difficulty of accessing epistemologies from different worlds or different forms of life. That is, in arguing that place and locatedness serve as a sort of bedrock for epistemic claims, you also are foregrounding that this means that those who don't share place and locatedness might not be able to access other knowledges. Epistemological extractivism, as you call it, is a real concern. I have learned from Mohawk and Anishinaabe theorist Vanessa Watts, for example, that removing Indigenous knowledges from the practices and places they emerge in empties them of their real content and is thus a form of epistemic violence. And I think that Rika tends to this potential harm so carefully here, committing to trying to understand other ways of knowing without problematically romanticizing or appropriating them, as if we could know them as our own, is demanding but important work, especially as we continue to strive to make meaningful space for a variety of voices to be heard. So thank you, Rika, for foregrounding this thorny issue and for providing an example of how to do such work in a way that is humble and self-aware of the limits to knowing across different worlds and different forms of life. So I know we want to get to the discussion, and I'm sure that many in the audience have questions too, but I thought I would just take a moment before cluing up to raise a few queries that I thought your work sort of implicitly raises, which will perhaps help get the discussion going here today. Rika, I'm going to just say my 4 questions at once. I'm happy to repeat them after separately. I don't mean for it to be overwhelming. And you can certainly engage with some or none as you like. But first, while I think you've implicitly pointed to this, I was wondering if you could elaborate on the relationship between embodiment and place. I think there's obviously a very thick relationship there, but I was also wondering if that relationship might sometimes work or unfold in unexpected ways. How might our embodiment and the knowledges that our bodies hold change depending on the place we find ourselves in at any given moment, for example? Relatedly, I was also wondering, what is the relationship between embodiment, place, and then also socio-political economic situatedness, that is positionality in systems of privilege? So for instance, political economist Cristina Rojas has argued that a key part of justifying the colonial project in the Americas was locating Indigenous people closer to nature. When filtered through the modern binary that separates humans and nature and places humans in a position of controlling nature, Indigenous people's deep relations with nature, their relation to place, was mobilized by the colonizers to cast those people as less than human, as they were closer to nature. This in turn served to justify colonial violence. In other words, place was used in this case to position whole groups of people in marginalized positions within systems of power. I also was wondering, how does foregrounding, place, and embodiment change our mechanisms of accountability? I don't quite adhere to this argument, but could it not be suggested that we might become less accountable if place is key? Those very far from our place might be easy to ignore. I'm reminded here a bit of the work of Fiona Robinson and Virginia Held, who in arguing for the ethics of care as a global ethic have dealt extensively with the issue of distance. And lastly, I was really inspired by your work here in terms of how it might complicate our very understanding of ignorance. For example, the limits to knowing across worlds that you highlight in some ways means that ignorance will be unavoidable. In fact, acknowledging that we can't fully know in many contexts might be ethically and epistemically important and valuable. On the other hand, I think we have to be careful that the acknowledgement of these limits to knowing doesn't let us off the hook from trying to know and understand. Do you have thoughts then on how the very concept of ignorance might be complicated by listening seriously to other voices, especially voices which hold knowledges that we do not embody from places that we are not embedded in? I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on these questions, as well as from the questions that the audience will pose. As a final point, which Dan, you also already did for me, but I did want to say that I'm so very pleased that a chapter based on this work is underway for an edited volume called Decentering Epistemologies and Challenging Privilege, Critical Care Ethics Perspectives. I have the great privilege and pleasure to be co-editing this volume with 2 incredible care ethicists, Fiona Robinson, who I see is here, and Sophie Bourgault. For those of you who are interested in engaging more fully with care epistemologies and questions of decentering epistemology, including Rika's very important work, I encourage you to keep your eyes peeled for that volume in the next year. So thank you so much, everyone, and I'm excited for the discussion.
Thank you. Those are great comments. So Rika, it's really up to you. Do you want to maybe respond to a couple of those, and then for you all, everyone else, if you want to start jumping in, you can go ahead and just send me a little chat saying you have a question or a comment or something, and I'll start lining you up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Maggie. These are amazing questions and really, really important ones. So yeah, thank you. I'm really happy that you took the time to respond like that. And also I wanted to thank you again for, you've already given me some initial feedback on a previous draft of that, which you didn't have to do, and you did it in such a kind and generous way, and it already made everything much more coherent. So I'm really very thankful for your work. Yeah, so I want to maybe start from the back, from the last question, and then I can see how long I talk and maybe work my way forward, and anybody else who wants to ask questions can obviously jump in. So the question of complicating understandings of ignorance, I think is an interesting one. And so as I said in the talk, and also has been mentioned, my work on epistemology really started out with this question of epistemic ignorance and sort of active unknowing as reliable, pernicious, and with harmful consequences. And I'm here was very much influenced by the work of Twan and Sullivan, Mills, Alcoff, but also a very big fan of Christy Dodson's work and Jose Medina, who sort of make this point now that, that ignorance can be very convenient for those in power, and that it is a strategy of buffering privilege. And so while this is really important work, and I think we cannot lose sight of that, my own understanding of ignorance has also been complicated or made more nuanced actually by Rinda Dalmia, who I see he's also here today. And so, yeah, so she alerted me really as in a very beautiful conversation that we had at the first Care Ethics Research Consortium conference back in Portland a couple of years ago, to this fact that there is more to ignorance than epistemic ignorance. And so that there are, and I shouldn't probably be talking about it because in retrospect, I feel that I probably only understood half of the smart things she said, so I shouldn't be talking, she should be talking about it. But that there are, you know, that there are other ways of looking at ignorance as sort of in the shadows, or sort of buffering at the edges of knowledge. But maybe she wants to, I don't want to put her on the spot, but she probably can talk much more elaborately about different understandings or multiplicities of ignorance. But as you highlighted here, Maggie, in some instances, ignorance might be unavoidable and maybe even a good thing. And so that there's ethical, or sort of also metaphysical boundaries about the things we can or should know. And important for my thinking around that was really engaging with Indigenous and Aboriginal epistemologies. That raised the question who can or who should know certain things. But then simultaneously, and I've not included that in the draft, but it's sort of a flag that I maybe want to raise about my own work, or maybe get your input on as well, is the question of like that this sort of who or which groups of people can and should know certain things could also obviously be instrumentalized or used in ways that I'm totally not fine with. For instance, if we're thinking, you know, very old arguments of, you know, women cannot know blah because they're just, you know, not capable or whatever, like it could be instrumentalized or used in such a way as well. And I'm not quite sure yet how to guard against that. So if people have thoughts on that, I would love to hear it. And your question on how to listen to other voices across difference, yeah, that's really the project. So I can't say that I have the answer yet, but it will certainly include, as you also pointed out, stances of humility and responsiveness and a certain decentering of oneself. So I guess I'm talking about decentering and also centering oneself in different ways in this. Yeah, so that was maybe already a lot for one question, but I also wanted to say something about the question you raised about accountability and sort of this danger of provincializing, of this serving as a provincializing move, which is a really, really important question actually. And I thank you for flagging that important danger, because I think it's like one of those things that seems so, as I said, like in my previous work on epistemic ignorance, and sort of that very much held at its core the question of power imbalances and asymmetries. It was like very what's the word? Like, it was very clear that this was, of course, there, but I see now that I haven't spelled it out here, so I should probably do that. And so in my work on the International Division of Reproductive Labor, and so in my engaging with care ethics, it's always necessarily been on a global scale. And so that sort of thinking of how asymmetry is also my bringing in on connecting it to decolonial theory, I hope speaks to that. But it is incredibly important, obviously, to keep that in mind as well. So I guess, that I just assumed that it's evident, but I guess I have to spell it out more carefully. And connecting back to the question of listening or learning from indigenous epistemologies, what I've also sort of on the question of provincializing, what I've also learned from my friend and colleague in Australia, Jennifer Newman, she sort of, the way that she's explained it is that, so in pre-contact Aboriginal Australia, but also now, there's obviously engagement between different First Nations. So it's not that being rooted or sort of being connected to a particular country forecloses any contact with people from and in other First Nations. And so it's not so much an isolating move, but it's more that this engagement that obviously is also happening and is encouraged is happening from a place of sort of like in a respectful way that acknowledges traditional traditional relations to place, which I think is really important. But then at the same time, having said that, obviously these respectful ways of relating across place have been violently damaged through colonization. And then also, of course, the question of how, like in which particular places so many of us are located is not a straightforward, it's not a straightforward question, or it does not have a straightforward answer. So of course, it's more complicated than that. But yeah, just to say that, yeah, it's an important danger that you're raising. And I probably have to also, again, spell that out more clearly, because I'm not like advocating for a, isolating or sort of provincializing move. Not that you were saying that I'm doing that, but it's really important to keep that question as well. Should we maybe switch to the audience, or should I keep going? Because I can keep going as well.
Let's see if we have, if anyone wants to jump in here. Jenny.
Thank you, Rika and Maggie. Really more interesting and important work. And I have a question for you, which is I think of as a really hard question, which I don't have an answer to, and arises in my own work. So it's not that I expect you to roll off a simple answer, but there's a sort of chicken and egg problem with learning from care. That is, and I think it's actually even harder in the context of care for the earth. People can only learn to experience the care that we receive from the earth, and therefore a sense of responsibility back to the earth, I think, by actually the embodied practice of caring for the earth. But how do you persuade people to do this when it's coded, not just as the general denigration of care, but it's really outside the epistemic framework of urban people in the global north. So, and there are some answers, like gardening. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about that, but it is such a hard problem, and it intersects with the point that Maggie raised, that there's a deep story of denigration of indigenous relations to the earth, even of indigenous spirituality as primitive because of its relation to the earth and animals. And so it's overlaid with all of that in colonial contexts. So I just wonder whether all the work you've done has given you any insight into what helps people take that first step of being willing to do the work to learn from care?
Thank you. Yeah, excellent and very difficult question. Indeed. Yeah, and I do agree that it is very much a circular thing that we have to engage with here somehow. I guess the approach that I, in my particular case, I'm taking, because I mean, like behind this all, obviously there are many things, I guess, that are motivating me to do this work, but there's always also one strong motivation of the question of how to distribute this more fairly and more sustainably, this work that nobody wants to do. And as you said, like the motivation, sorry, am I? Yeah, no, I'm not muted. The motivation part is specifically with domestic cleaning, like there's not much incentive to do that work. So I guess I'm sneakily trying to say, you do not understand, like you're not missing out. So I'm trying to, also sort of draw a horizon of like, there's something positive, come and get this, in a way. I mean, I guess that's maybe also how I'm building this argument, but I want to point out that there are things to be learned. Of course, who will hear and who will want to listen to this is an entirely different question, but yeah. And to that, maybe that lets me relate also again with Maggie's question on sort of the question of the relation between embodiment, place, and socio-political economic positionality, this question of human versus nature. That, yeah, definitely, it's a very huge reality that certainly in the Aboriginal Australian context, that's very much ongoing, that like even the way that Australia is advertised as a tourist destination, it's always come see our beautiful landscapes. We have nature, and Aboriginal culture is very much advertised as part of this nature. So that's a real issue. But I think that the way to get out of this is not to say, no, obviously Aboriginal people are humans. I'm not trying to make a case against that, but it's not to say, I guess my solution is to really strongly challenge this split in the first place as one that has led to so many of our problems and is leading to so many of our problems, including global climate catastrophe that is very much rooted in that split of human and nature, and and how it has been instrumental in extracting and subjugating colonized peoples, but also nature. And I want to maybe at this point also shout out to Malcolm Ferdinand's work. And if you're not familiar with it, it's recent. So it's been published first in French and now recently been translated into English as Decolonial Ecology. And he's making this argument basically that from the very beginning of colonialism, there is an interconnection between the subjugation of the earth and of colonized peoples. And so that struggles against that also have to go together. So struggles against coloniality have to go together with environmental or ecological struggles, and that these are very much interlinked. So I think it's more about, challenging the split that leads to the subjugation and conflates indigenous people with nature than it is to say, than to uphold the split and say, well, they are human people as well, because we are all, as humans, part of nature, I think. It was a very long answer again.
And I think Jenny wants to ask a quick follow-up, and then Maurice has a question.
Yeah, just a really quick follow-up. Because I actually think that there may be more hope to get people to pay attention to care for the earth, because so many people are aware of the problems of climate change, and to help them see that the kinds of policy transformations, the massive policy transformations that have to take place in order to accomplish that, must be motivated by many levels of shift, including an affective shift towards connection to the earth. And so when you say, come and get it, come and get the learning about cleaning the floor, I actually sort of hope that maybe come and get the learning about the earth may have a stronger pull at the moment, even though it still has some of this circularity because it requires a kind of hands-on work that we just think is not possibly a source of genuine knowledge. Anyway, thanks again.
Go ahead, Maurice.
Hey, Rika, thank you so much for a very rich presentation. I've taken lots of notes, and you made me think about a lot of different directions. And so I have kind of some rambling comments. There might be a question in there somewhere. I'm fascinated by the exploration of epistemologies of ignorance, in regard to care, because there's just an interesting mechanism within care epistemology. If going back to some of Nell Nodding's, early works, she talked about how the one caring dreads the proximal stranger who is in need because it's going to activate. I'm going to have to do that work. I'm going to have to care, if I come to that, if I come to that knowledge. And so it's an interesting internal mechanism, a possible, barrier that makes care sometimes seem like it is more passive. And, how do we get active, the active inquiry that is necessary to initiate care. I was also, very interested in what you had to say about men's activities, and I'm particularly concerned about, masculinity's role and all of the, particularly if we're thinking about, I want to say toxic masculinity, but even maybe just everyday masculinity that skews a lot of the values of caring, and how embodied practice can help get past that kind of ignorance. I've been particularly taken by the work of a social anthropologist, Aaron Jackson. He wrote this book, Worlds of Care: The Emotional Lives of Fathers Caring for Children with Disabilities. And I can put the reference in the chat to the book. And the reason I think it's relevant is he's steeped in care theory, and he studied men who were taking care of severely disabled children, and he talks about the embodied interaction with those children. And he in turn also was raising a severely disabled child himself. And he talks about experiences like taking that child to play soccer by strapping him to his own body and playing soccer with him so he could experience this, but also just the day-to-day caring of his child, and how that challenged his notions of masculinity and interconnectedness with other people as a kind of, a kind of epiphany, that breaks through some of this, some of the ignorance. Ignorance also seems like, it's an interesting word, because is it a passive or is it an active ignorance? How much agency is there in that ignorance? So anyway, I'm sorry that wasn't a better articulated question, but I found your presentation so stimulating in so many different ways that I was trying to bring all the thoughts together into one. But I thank you, and I look forward to the publication of this.
Thank you, Maurice. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, maybe the only thing that I want to add is, yeah, the question of ignorance, like, is it active or passive? I think there are active forms and there are passive forms, and there are innocent forms and there are pernicious forms. So I think all of the things exist in different contexts in different ways. That's at least my thinking about it now at this moment.
Maggie?
I don't want, if there's someone else who wants to go, I don't, because I spoke quite a bit. But, I wondered too, like, I think fear and fear of our vulnerability is really tied up in certain forms of ignorance. You know, Maurice, as you just said, the risk of having someone demand a care response from us can feel very vulnerable. And then we might want to be ignorant to it, whether consciously or not. Or Jenny, to your point, like, in so many ways, I thought at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought, well, this will really rupture the liberal imaginary. We will really understand we are not separate from nature, and that this little tiny bug will grow into this thing, and our relational, like the air we breathe, like, what could foreground our relationality and vulnerability more than the pandemic? But my goodness, has that imaginary been sticky? Like, we also really haven't seen this sort of deep acknowledgement, again, that we're in and of nature. In fact, there was sort of very, you know, a fear response, which was both in many ways practical, of isolating, and of, you know, very practical in many ways, but also, you know, I don't know, I guess there's not really a question here, but just thinking about fear and fear of confronting our vulnerability, that someone would demand something of us, the risk of that, of acknowledging that, yeah, you know, nature is, we are dependent on it in so many ways, and we're hurting it, and that's hurting ourselves. I think there's something about the fear and trauma of that really upholds these binaries. And I think, again, Gilligan and Snyder's work on the trauma of loss and why we don't want to look at these things, because it feels like we're protecting ourselves from acknowledging or living with our vulnerability is kind of important when we're thinking about why people, you know, are ignorant or can't overcome ignorance in certain ways. I guess not really a question, but just it's all very thought-provoking, which is what's so wonderful about these sessions.
I want to ask a couple quick questions, and then Jenny's there too. These are just really trying to just understand. Again, I thought that was a great talk, and I have all these sheets of paper in front of me from things that you made me think about. But I just want to understand a couple things. And some things that were swirling through my head. You started out talking about how the dominant Western epistemology devalues embodied knowing, and then you move to talk about that with regard to embodied care work. But I was thinking, you know, I mean, I'm not sure if you're trying to draw a straight line that. I mean, it seems like you know, this is nothing new, but right, all sorts of feminized and you know, feminized work or care work is especially reviled, right? Because there are these forms of embodied knowing that are quite well respected, I think, within a Western epistemology. I mean, I'm thinking of things like sports or carpentry, or right, these masculinized types of activities where it's understood that it takes this embodied practice to know the field. And, you know, I mean, with basketball, you know, this kind of like shooting the free throw over and over and making these small adjustments in your body and how you're handling the ball, and, you know, all this kind of stuff, right? So I just kind of wanted to ask about that. If you're trying to make this broad claim about kind of a Western way of knowing, or if this is actually more specific, you know, just more specific masculine, you know, kind of disregard for these feminine ways of embodied knowing. And then kind of related, just a second quick point is, it seemed like at points when you were talking, and maybe a little bit when Jenny was talking, you know, I don't know about this, but it seemed like there's kind of this assumption that knowing will lead to valuation. that's not, it seems like that's not necessarily the case, right? Somebody can know, somebody can do the embodied care work and then walk away from it and still say like that was, that was stupid, or, that was easy, or I mean, maybe a little bit what you're saying, the person you talked to, like, I just want to pay, that was horrible, I'm going to pay someone to do that. I never want to have to do that again. I never want to have to clean the toilet again, or care for the baby again, or whatever it is. And so there are a couple ways then of thinking about that. One way of thinking about that is that knowing is valuing, and the people who don't value aren't really knowing. Or another way of thinking about that is that there's this additional step after knowing to valuing, in which case, I guess, I just wonder what, what that means about these epistemologies, these embodied epistemologies.
Thank you, Dan, and also thank you, Maggie. That was a very, very important and super smart, as always, comment. I want to say maybe to the last points now. So I try to, so you're absolutely right, Dan, about the point. So I think that doing can lead to knowing, can lead to caring. Doesn't necessarily, doing can lead to knowing, can lead to valuation, I wanted to say. So there is no, it's not necessarily so. And as you said, there will be many people who turn away from it. But I think that, there will no be valuation and no knowing without the doing. And so I guess that's what I'm trying to, so it doesn't necessarily, so it can work out. It doesn't have to work out, but it will definitely not work out if we don't start with the practice. And then that's at least how I'm thinking about it and how I'm trying to make the argument. So also in my written text, I often say, like, I will have the can lead to blah, because I think that, as you rightly observed, it doesn't have to work that way, and for many people it will not. But I think we cannot arrive at this destination without going through the steps, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And your point about the particular, like, feminized versions of knowledge, I have to be also maybe, I think a bit more about that, but so maybe I have to be more specific that it's sort of the very, like, it's a specific cognitive notion that I'm thinking about here. And one word on the question of vulnerability and fear of vulnerability, I think that's all very true. And it's especially interesting, I think, when we talk about men and masculinities, because that's a huge issue with men and masculinities, that vulnerability is just not a thing that easily fits with, like, the sort of dominant conceptions of masculinity. And so I think it's even more, and that's why we have, like, all of these questions around why am I not doing the work, because it's like sort of even further removed. But maybe that's enough. I see that Rinda has a question.
Rinda has a question, and then Joan has a question. So we're lining them up. Thanks, Pat. That was great. Rinda, you're up. You're still muted.
Sorry. Thanks. Thank you, Rika. That was fascinating. And particularly, I loved the way you are trying to draw a connection between place in indigenous frameworks and the place of domesticity through care. And that's that I'm trying to wrap my head around the wonderful potentials that could emerge from that move. Now, it's more of a comment on rather than a question, and an idea that I want to share. And this comes from Maggie's one of Maggie's dilemmas that she raised, and which is the sort of paradox of the unavoidability of our acknowledging ignorance, yet avoiding the danger of this acceptance of ignorance not leading us off the hook. So how do we negotiate that? And of course, a lot has been said, and you too in your response mentioned the distinction between active and passive ignorances. And I'm wondering whether we can build on that a little bit and not think of ignorance just as an absence of knowledge, but almost a different way of relating to an object. Ignorance being a positive state with its own distinctive content. And if somehow we can articulate that content, then maybe we could get the step of being accountable to this object, which appears to us in our ignorance. So basically, very inchoately, I'm trying to struggle with but I'm thinking of ignorance as trying to grasp something in a shadow, and where there is content, but it's not a very well-defined content. So it leaves room for, number one, humility on our part, but more importantly, it leaves room for a realism about the object being grasped in ignorance, so that the object can speak back to us and tell us that we are wrong or right. So anyway, just thinking of ignorance as a positive state and a different kind of positive relation, rather than just concentrating on knowledge states as relations to the object. Just a thought, and sorry, it a little embarrassing, but anyway.
Thank you so much. That was very excellent, very, very helpful, and very, very relevant, very helpful for me. Yeah, and I think I'm still trying to grasp it. And I remember that, so you back then also talked about the shadow. And I think that's a very helpful image, because obviously there is something there, but we don't know the content of it. So we know the presence, but we don't know what's in there, basically.
Right, that's.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let me go to Joan.
Hi, everyone. Rika, thank you for this wonderful paper. Thank you all for your really thoughtful comments. Vrinda, thank you for that piece on ignorance. It's really helpful. And Dan, since I have the floor, I'm going to say, Dan, thank you so much for bringing us all together and keeping us sane over these last 2 years. The question I want to ask you, though, Rika, is about place in a slightly different way. As Vrinda began her comment, she said there are two places here: the place of the indigenous peoples and the place of domestic care. But obviously there are many more places and many more relations to place that are important for you to think about or include. One of the issues about place I've been thinking about a lot for some years and just haven't figured out how to write about this is this. The whole colonial project, of course, involves a breaking of place to become a colonist in the first place. Right? And it's even from that first image with this dirty kitchen that's so dark. I mean, all of us relate to that in some way. I mean, I'm happy to say my kitchen doesn't look like that. But if it did, maybe it gives the person who lives there comfort to see their mess. I don't know, but it's really interesting that place is very deep within all people, including Western people who write novels. And that place is really important for people. But somehow in the Western tradition, or not in the Western tradition, but historically in the 16th century, 15th and 16th centuries, people decided to give up place and go somewhere else. And part of it, of course, was that there were political forces that forced them to move as groups, but then there were individuals who did it and did horrifying things to other humans and the rest of the world. And then we get to the point of settler colonialism, which is in a sense the other side of the indigenous place. And settlers also have a connection to their place. So Connell's work on Southern knowledge ends with her talking about, as a white settler in Australia, how much the place means to her. And that's a really important other piece of what place might come to mean. So I think you've just opened up for us a whole other set of questions about how we might think about, how we do think about how care relates to not just time, which we all recognize, but also to place. And there's a relationship of place. I mean, place is a very complicated thought and idea because proximity can create the opportunity for people to come to know each other and to then, care for each other. The close stranger Maurice mentioned before. But it also provides the opportunity for people to really lose track of or make assumptions about, because they think, oh, well, if you're my next door neighbor, you must think the same way I do. Or if you're in this community, you must be part of my idea of what the community norms are, right? So they're really complicated things that come out of this idea of place. And I just want to thank you for raising it. I'm not asking you for a full theory of account of what place might mean here, but I think it's really, you've really started to talk about something that's really important, but there are, again, so many dimensions of it that we need to kind of be careful not to close in on just a few.
Thank you, Joan. That was, again, very, very generous and very important. Yeah, you're absolutely right that obviously the colonial project is a project of breaking connection to place, or sort of breaking place as well in different ways. And I think going to be very vulnerable here now, but sort of for me, it also, like sort of the importance of place for me as well became more apparent or more visible when I migrated to Australia and sort of came in contact with not necessarily my own, decenteredness, but sort of to see how place is important there, and sort of, the question that was being raised again and again in certain Indigenous circles of that it's a problem that white people and settlers in particular have a problem with place, and so I guess. And so for me, coming from Austria, it kept bringing up questions of where, obviously for me, it seems relatively straightforward where my place is, because I am, not a refugee. I have a home here where I am allowed to exist. And so it seems straightforward, but I find it really difficult to connect to that particular place. And then obviously we also know that, apart from all the colonial explicit complicity of this being obviously part of Europe, that is again and again ignored in the Austrian context, but then also the question of tradition in this place that brought up Nazism, basically. So to think about tradition and traditional relating to place in this context is very precarious and scary. And so you easily slide into, or sort of people who do that in this space, mostly to the right of the political spectrum. And so I feel not much space to do that. And to do that in a meaningful and, sort of decolonial and proper way. But So I feel that, like what you said is absolutely right, obviously, that it's a breaking of place. And I do not want to say that, obviously, for me as a white person from Austria, this is such a big issue, when, of course, I do acknowledge that the breaking of place for Indigenous people is like a different level to what I'm experiencing. But I'm thinking that in that process of breaking place in other places, what Europe really did was also breaking place here and sort of breaking connections and sort of losing this place-centeredness that obviously, you know, has been in all of the places at different times. So not only Indigenous communities. Yeah, I hope that that was somehow coherent, not too crazy. But yeah, I guess one last bit maybe that I want to add is that for me personally, and that is maybe a very subjective thing, but for me, so whenever I come, you know, travel or, you know, work in a specific place for some time, for me personally, it's always important to like start cleaning the place to make it mine. And so maybe hence also the interest in cleaning. But for me, it's and in this case, a practice of cleaning, but I think it's, for me personally, engaging with that place is really what makes me think that I have some right to be here or sort of belong in some way. So it's engaging with place. And I think cleaning is one way of engaging with place. And in the Aboriginal Australian context, caring as country is also very much about obviously caring for that which is around, but that which is within. So in that term really came to be more popularized in the Australian context through health and mental health discourses. And so that caring for country was important to sustain Aboriginal people as in their health. And yeah, so I think there are definitely connections. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for being patient, Jenny. You now have the floor.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad I waited to get to hear these other comments. So my own work has now circled me back to where I began, which is on property, because the concept and law and ideology of property is both how societies mark the value of place and the tool they use for colonialism and the breaking of place. And so I think we really have to, I see it as a kind of full circle that I'm bringing back my relational work, the care work, back to developing a new conception of property, because it's so essential to find some new way of capturing the value of place, which is what property was supposed to do and does do, but in very harmful ways. So I just wanted to put this, my new project, on the table. And then just remind, some of you will remember this, Sarah Hoagland, Lesbian Ethics. She wrote about that the word ignorance should always be thought of as a verb to ignore. And she had really interesting things to say about that. And finally, I just wanted to comment on the various comments that have come up about vulnerability and the fear of vulnerability and why this is why we want to turn away from care. Because in the end, I ended up being persuaded to cut a chunk about this from my too long book, because it was kind of speculative, but I actually think it's really important speculation. And the particular way I posed it was, what do the powerful get out of relying on categories of who should do care? And the answer is, well, if there are definite categories of the kind of people who should do care, and they are not powerful white men, they can be confident that no one's going to ever ask them to do it. And that places a wall, a barrier, a boundary between them and the scary vulnerability that doing care entails. And I actually think that's a big part of the whole story of the relationship between power, hierarchy, and the denigration of care. But so I'm saying this to all of you because I'm keen to hear your different ways of thinking about that and evidence for it, because it is sort of speculative, and for some people it edges on, psychoanalytic, which makes them anxious. And anyway, but I think it's really a hugely important piece of the story. So thank you, Rika, for generating all this fruitful conversation.
Yeah, and with that, we are at our 1:30 time frame, so we should wrap things up here. Rika, thank you. That was a great paper, very thought-provoking as the conversation showed. Thank you, Maggie. You did a wonderful job getting us started and raising lots of very powerful questions for us to all think about. And thanks for everyone for being here, for your questions, your comments, listening. This is great. It's been a great year for me being part of all this, and because everyone's been here and saying such great things all the time. So I look forward to this, and we'll try to get things up and running again in the fall. So have a nice summer, have a safe summer. I guess I'll see some of you though in a week at the Visualizing Care conference. So we have that to look forward to next week. So it's not over yet. So thank you all. Have a great weekend and a great summer until I see you again. Bye.